Okay, this interview has been tape recorded. The interview is being conducted in an interview room at Antrim Police Station. Robert, could you give me your full name, please?
Robert Black.
Okay, and your date of birth, please?
21/4/47.
The reason that Robert Black, I think, is one of the most dangerous people I've ever met is because you would not look twice at him if you walked down the street. He just looks ordinary, but his crimes were so horrific.
If you saw a young girl, tell me what would happen then.
He was admitting nothing. So how to prove all those years later that he was the man who had killed these girls?
What happened after the arrest of Robert Black was even more remarkable than what happened before.
There are a number of issues, Robert, that we would like to talk to you about. Are you happy enough with that?
Carry on, see how it goes.
A massive hunt for the missing girl was called off this afternoon after her body was found in the lake.
Mrs. Maxwell said that day had been the first time Susan had been allowed to walk home alone.
50 officers are scouring the area looking for clues.
Caroline was allowed out to play for just 5 minutes. She was last seen in the company of a 30 to 40-year-old man.
Police searchers started near the spot where Sarah was found and worked their way upstream along the banks of the River Trent.
He's not going to stop at Sarah, is he?
Black drove his transit van through a village on the Scottish borders. Here he abducted a schoolgirl but was spotted and stopped by the local police.
Maybe it was the beginning of the road to some sort of justice.
Would you like to look at the person who murdered your daughter?
We didn't find any forensic evidence that connected Robert Black with any of these children.
A predatory paedophile who targeted young girls. How could it not be him?
You really have to go into every dark corner of the case and try and get the next piece of evidence.
Robert Black was the red flag killer. This had to work. There was no other way out.
He's a vile, evil man. A man of the most evil kind.
July 1990, 7 years after Caroline, 8 years after Susie, 4 years after Sarah Harper. The police officers stop the van, and the driver of the van is Robert Black. Underneath all the clutter, there is like a purpose-built sleeping bag. And in that sleeping bag, they found a wee girl. Pull the girl out, and Robert Black's arrested.
It was immediately apparent that the circumstances of that abduction were special, to say the least. The way in which she had been very forcibly bound, gagged, this is out of the ordinary. This is just not right. This is not a first time. He's done this before, without doubt. There was more to this guy than we thought. Immediately, you have a localised crime to investigate, but while you're doing that, you're discovering things at that crime scene and in that vehicle that set alarm bells ringing big style. He was a driver. He delivered posters throughout the UK. He had a van which he used basically as a mobile home. He had sleeping bags, he had a foam mattress, he had foodstuffs, bindings, ties, implements which would suggest some form of sexual activity taking place. Everything pointing to travelling the length and breadth of the country and prepared to forcibly abduct children. And it was really quite menacing.
He's a loner. He has failed to have relationships with adults. He was obsessed by pornography. He's obsessed by children. He is the classic offender.
Robert Black appeared at the High Court in Edinburgh in August of 1990. Within less than a month of his arrest, he was tried and convicted. He pled guilty for the offence in Stow. He was sentenced to a mandatory life sentence for abduction and assault to the danger of life.
Robert Black left Edinburgh High Court to start a life sentence for what the judge described as a horrific, appalling case. The court was told that if she hadn't been discovered, she could have died within the hour.
We have Robert Black in prison, and we still have 3 unsolved, significant, major child murder inquiries on our hands. It was quite clear at that stage that, given the circumstances that we already knew about the deaths previously of Susan Maxwell in 1982, Caroline Hogg in 1983, and Sarah Harper, and the abduction in Stow, that this could very well be the most viable suspect that we'd yet seen to date after all these years of investigation.
They had him in prison. Now, could they prove that he had committed other murders? Maybe it was the beginning of the road to some sort of justice for the families of those whose daughters didn't survive.
When it's a child, it affects everyone. Everybody wanted some answers and wanted someone being convicted for what had happened.
When I saw a photograph of him and the descriptions that we'd been given at the time, I just knew it had to be him. That was the man who'd committed the murder of Sarah Harper and the others.
There was no question that this inquiry had to work. There was no other way out. We had 3 cases which were definitely linked together. They were massive in terms of documentation, records, forensics. To my knowledge, there's never been a linked serial murder investigation involving children to anything like the extent that this was. There was an inherent negativity, a fear that this was all too big, all too complex, all too challenging. We had no idea whether there was any head of steam to take this to trial at all. We had huge responsibility and we just had to find a way through.
Detectives from Lothian and Borders have been questioning a 43-year-old man. Inquiries into his background led them to visit a rented bedsit in the Stamford Hill area of North London, where it's understood a number of items were removed for forensic examination.
There were a huge number of challenges from a forensic perspective. The first one was just the sheer volume of work.
In terms of Robert's accommodation in London, when we searched that flat, we discovered swimwear belonging to children, skirts, clothing, objects which were used as part of his own self-abuse.
There were something like 4,000 individual items ranging from tubes of toothpaste through to pornographic cinefilms.
Child sex magazines, videotapes which he spliced together, photographs, scrapbooks, but all very, very worryingly centred around the direct abuse of young female children.
His entire material world was in the hall in Lothian and Borders Police. Everything he possessed, apart from whatever he wore in prison.
It must have been an absolute nightmare to our forensic people to stand there and think, well, where do we start with this lot?
It was probably the biggest case in the country since the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. We went through pretty much all 4,000 items and we reduced them to a few hundred. The focus on these items was to look for hairs, fibres, blood, saliva, that was being transferred to black from the victims or from the victims back to black. It's quite a tiring process, staring down a microscope for hours on end. And of course, if you get tired, you could miss something. But despite the time spent on the case and the extent of the examinations, we didn't find any forensic evidence that connected Robert Black with any of these children.
They went through every single item, and at the end of the day, there was not one single item of evidence in there that forensically linked Robert Black to these investigations.
He wasn't talking, he was admitting nothing. So how to prove all those years later without forensic evidence that he was the man who had killed these 3 girls?
In the absence of forensic evidence, I think it's realistic to say that nowadays the average member of the public understands police work or detective work to be CCTV cameras in forensic science. Nothing could be further from the truth. Certainly in 1990, nothing could be further from the truth, or in 1982, 83 or 86. It was just slogging, common, down-to-earth detective work. Get out there, do the work. Don't expect it to come in, fall into your lap. You've got to go and find it. And we began to dig in for a long haul, principally to try to eliminate Robert Black from his involvement in these murders. And that's an important point. It sounds counterintuitive to the public, but it is in fact perfectly rational when you think about it. Eliminate this person, and if you can't eliminate him, he's your man. You start to retrospectively look back and put a magnifying glass over what was by then 8 years of investigation. We decided a 3-pronged approach would be the best way to go strategically, and that consisted of looking at his employment records in terms of the wages that he earned and in terms of the deliveries that he made. He was given what we call petrol cards. These were small, almost like a credit card, which could be used at petrol stations to refill the vehicles. We could build up a picture of not only the driver's use of the card, but Robert Black's personal use of the card. He was a prolific hoarder of receipts. He would stop and buy a bottle of lemonade. He would subsequently find a receipt in his flat in London for a particular place at a particular time on a particular date, on days which are of significance to our inquiries. You have a picture of us superimposing one element over another element: deliveries, petrol, and wages.
The hunt for a possible triple child killer was stepped up at Easter when a police computer called Holmes came online after months of being fed with hundreds of thousands of separate pieces of information.
The advantage of the Holmes computerized system was that it enabled research to be done retrospectively.
The Holmes computer system was aptly named after Sherlock Holmes, and it stands for Home Office Large Major Inquiry Systems. So it was a database of information on all major inquiries. There was dedicated officers working on the computers, and that was their role, sifting through the information that they had and putting it onto the computer. The white van and where the bodies were found was very important.
We've traced all the vehicles that he used over a period of years. We've physically recovered and forensically examined them. He used vans all the time. Once we discovered Robert Black was using white vans, we then looked back and we put in white van Coldstream, where Susan Maxwell was last seen. Boom. Up comes the unidentified sighting by witness A of a white van on the offside of the road south of the Tweed Bridge at Coldstream. And at that time it was driven and used by Robert Black, who had shortly before picked up petrol at Stannington petrol station and was en route to Edinburgh to deliver posters.
The Holmes computer was absolutely revolutionary. It just saved months and months of work.
We plot him on these different days. We plot him on the 30th of July for Susan Maxwell. We plot him for the 26th of March for Sarah Harper, and we plot him for the 8th of July for Caroline Hogg. Likewise, we plot him again on the days around the deposition dates, and we gradually see a very strong, very potent picture linking him entirely across these 3 incidents. That's always a realistic possibility that somebody else might come out from the massive evidence as being a more preferred suspect. It didn't happen in this case. From day one, Robert Black was the red flag killer. He was implicated at every turn.
Putting together the huge circumstantial case that Hector Clark and Roger Orr did was astonishing. They wove an incredibly complex, fine mesh net to show that Robert Black had the motive, he had the opportunity, he was there at the time. They simply put together a case which so compelling, which showed Robert Black in all the right places at the right times.
It was immensely challenging on multiple fronts. What began to emerge was an idea seeking to use a very unique legal process known as similar fact evidence.
Evidence of similar fact means you could use the example of the abduction in Stow to say, look, this is what he did. And here is Susie Maxwell, identical circumstances. And here is Caroline Hogg, identical circumstances. And here is Sarah Harper, identical circumstances. So you're saying to the jury, how could it not be him? How could it not be him?
The Deputy Chief of Lothian and Borders Police has headed a 9-year inquiry into the deaths of the 3 girls. 6 police forces were involved.
I can confirm that late today, criminal proceedings have been issued on the authority of the Crown Prosecution Service against Robert Black, aged 44 years, a driver from London.
Robert Black was driven to Newcastle's Moot Hall for his Crown Court trial this morning for the alleged abduction and murder of 3 schoolgirls in the 1980s. The defendant himself was covered by a blanket as he emerged from a police van. 6 police forces have been involved in the inquiry and have accumulated 20 tons of paperwork and evidence.
The mood in the courtroom was electric. It really contributed to the drama that was maintained throughout.
I think I would be wrong if I said that there wasn't any tension in that building. I've never gone through anything like that in my life. I don't think I will again, and I think that applied equally to all the officers there, let alone Jackie Harper, Annette Hogg, the Maxwells.
Jackie, Sarah's mum, how many years had passed and how old Sarah would have been at that point. I cannot imagine how that must have felt for her.
You can never bring Susie back or Caroline back or Sarah. Destroys the families of these girls. You never bring them back. But it's important that justice be done.
You can be confident, but you've got to be careful. Anything can happen because the job's not over until that foreman stands up.
Robert Black may be a convicted child molester, but that does not make him a murderer, his defence counsel said today. And Ronald Thwaites QC took the highly unusual step of revealing Black's criminal record to the court. For the first time, the jury has been told that Black is already serving life imprisonment for the abduction of a girl in 1990. But his criminal record goes back 3 decades, with sexual offences against schoolgirls in 1963 and 1967.
The trial was just over 5 weeks. Robert was his normal self, or what we'd come to understand as his normal self, pretty detached, pretty much disinterested, very little interaction with his counsel, if any, no handing down of notes or contesting evidence.
The most dramatic moment was when the jury, after weeks of listening to the increasingly compelling evidence, came back.
The thing that I always remember was that because of the fact that we were linking these cases using similar fact, we understood that if the very first charge was found not guilty, the rest fell. Conversely, if the very first charge was found as a guilty, the rest were going to be guilty. I looked up at Jackie Harper, I think, at the time, and she was kind of wide-eyed and semi-shocked looking, and there's not a lot you could have said. There was nothing anybody could say. It was palpable. First charge in the Maxwell case, guilty. It was just one massive sigh of relief. And then the foreman just proceeded to read out the 10 verdicts of guilty.
The families of his 3 victims listened and with considerable dignity heard the judge call Robert Black a very dangerous man and sentence him to life imprisonment 10 times over.
When he was convicted for all 3 of the murders, I can't tell you, it was a just fantastic day in my life. I was so pleased. Anybody that can pick up a young child from a roadside and do the things he did to them just cannot be anything other than evil.
I remember afterwards Susan's mother telling me she was very grateful to the jury for returning a unanimous verdict. It seemed very important to her that they all agreed that he'd done it.
Very, very relieved at the verdict. We'd like to thank the jury for coming to the right and just decision, although we've had a long wait for it.
There was enormous relief for the parents and the police who've grown close during this exhaustive investigation.
He's a vile, evil man, a man of the most evil kind.
Robert Black was evil, sadistic, had no compassion for his victims, for these children that he abducted and murdered, or for the families that were left behind.
A strange thing happened just immediately after the verdicts were recorded. Black was being taken down the steps and into the cell holding area below where we were. And unbelievably, and still unexplained to this day, he hesitated and he looked up. He was looking directly at me. And all he said was, "Well done, boys," and immediately put his head down and went down the steps. Never forget that. Yeah. Not easy.
Today, one of Britain's most far-reaching murder investigations finally ended. But the questions about what other terrible crimes Black may be responsible for are only just beginning.
Detectives working on unsolved cases want to visit Black in jail to find out if he killed even more children to satisfy his perverted mind.
We were given probably, I think, in excess of 40 cases to look at. And in many of those cases, we were able to eliminate him positively because we had a receipt placing him in a certain place on a certain date. Or, in 1 or 2 other cases, perhaps, there's a good chance this is him. 2 of them were Jeanette Tate in Devon in 1978 and Jennifer Cardy in Northern Ireland in 1981.
There was an opening of the case again in 1996. Detectives from Northern Ireland went across to England and spent time going through this.
We met the police in secret because we didn't want the press to get hold of it. We knew that there was a lot of work to be done, tons of paperwork to go through, van loads of it. We knew all of that.
Detectives from Devon and Cornwall Police and their colleagues from the RUC have come here to Wakefield, where they interviewed Robert Black until late last night. They want him to give them information about the disappearance of Jeanette Tate and the murder of Jennifer Cardy.
Robert Black was interviewed, but there were no firm conclusions drawn from that interview. He never admitted that he was in Northern Ireland, and it was decided at that point that there wasn't enough evidence to go forward with a prosecution, and the case went cold again.
Jennifer was always missed always talked about and always missed. But as a family, we had to live as a family. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we didn't suffer and miss Jennifer and think about it in our quiet times, but we didn't live it in front of other people. We didn't live in fear.
In 2002, I'm promoted to Detective Chief Inspector. The outgoing CID officer did a handover in their office and said, "Have you heard of the Jennifer Carty case?" and literally handed me a green folder. I actually read it that night. There were 3 people that were possibly connected to having carried out the offence. Only one of them was a fixated paedophile child molester of the nature of Robert Black. When Jennifer went missing, my father, he was a station sergeant. I was actually out for a quiet drink with my father, just talking, and he brought up the Carty case, turned around and said to me, "If there's one thing you do before you retire, solve the Carty case."
The one thing that struck me, that he was convinced that he would put an end to this. Raymond was on a mission, and his mission was that someday he would finish this case.
We went up to Moyer Police Station, the whole family, and they talked about how they're going to reopen the case and try and get Robert Black. I didn't think they were going to get a conviction because there was very little forensic evidence, and it might be going on more circumstantial evidence.
When you begin to look at the material that has been gathered diligently over the years, you suddenly begin to realise that this is actually a massive task. We knew it was going to be a long haul. We knew this was not going to be a case that was going to be resolved in weeks or months, and actually it was going to be probably measured in years. To be honest, you're supposed to get operational names out of a government database so that nobody duplicates it, but we did go slightly off-piste, and we felt that Operation Perseverance was probably the best name for it because that is what it was going to take.
We thought it would take years. We knew it would take years. I think they told us that at the time. So we were content to sit back.
What we did was re-interview every major member of the poster industry that we could find. And during those investigations, we found a new witness. A man who owned multiple poster display sites in a town called Newry in Northern Ireland. And the town of Newry is located at the bottom of the A1. And McKee's Dam, where Jennifer's body was located, is halfway along the A1. We knew that he came in on the ferry, and the ferry was docked at 7 a.m. We could prove that then from the harbour records. We knew that his deliveries would have been completed by 11 a.m., which put him right in the absolute time frame for having abducted Jennifer somewhere in around 1:40 to 2 p.m. when she was on her bicycle travelling. Pat had wound Jennifer's watch so that Jennifer would have the right time to know when to come back. The watch had stopped at 5:40, which again gave Black plenty of time to get to Belfast, to be at the docks, to get on the ferries. It was all these granular examinations that really began to harden up the time frame, and that circumstantial case began to get tighter and tighter and tighter. We felt that actually the case putting Robert Black in Northern Ireland had got really, really strong. We thought we had a body of evidence, but we were never going to be satisfied with that. You really have to go into every single dark corner of the case and try and get the next piece of evidence. A decision was made at that time that we would move towards interviewing Black himself.
The PSNI review approached me and asked me for any advice or assistance that I could give them in relation to the particular aspect of interviews with Robert Black. And I think that was valuable that we were able to give that to ongoing investigators who themselves would be faced with a limited time to cover a lot of material and a lot of points.
The planning for the interview took a year. The interviewers were very carefully picked, all highly, highly experienced. And we decided to use a male and a female interviewer. We talked to Roger about that, how that might create an interesting dynamic. The first key objective was, can we get him to admit that he is in Northern Ireland on the 12th of August?
Okay, this interview has been tape recorded. The interview is being conducted in an interview room at Antrim Police Station. Robert, could you give me your full name, please?
Robert Black.
Okay, and your date of birth, please?
21/4/47.
There are a number of issues, Robert, that we would like to talk to you about. Are you happy enough with that?
Carry on and see how it goes.
Okay.
I've got one question though.
Yeah.
Why in this situation is it always a female officer that talks about these things?
In what respect?
When I'm being interviewed by a male and a female, it seems when I'm questioned about these matters, it's always a female officer that does the question.
The interviews took 3 days. They were covered across 21 separate audio tapes. And after each interview, we would then discuss that interview, what it had told us evidentially, how it was impacting on him. Was he opening up? Was he closing down? What if he didn't speak? What if he did speak? What if he actually made a confession? So it was really, really agile. They immediately connected with the female interviewer, Pamela Simpson, who's fantastic. And Pamela's big skill was she could talk about the most horrendous things without any trace of judgment on either her face or her voice.
I'd be driving along and see a young girl. I'd get out and talk to her and try to persuade her to get into the van.
One of the things we did in order just to build that rapport and the connection was we had an original Collins 1981 road atlas, and we put that in front of him. And he's just fascinated by it because he's tracing it with his finger. He's completely engrossed in this. And we were fascinated watching him being fascinated. And you can almost see that rapport growing.
I'm not exactly proud of the way I feel towards young girls. Like, there's a part of me that knows I'm wrong, that knows that it's wrong, that I shouldn't be doing things like that. I shouldn't even be thinking things like that. But there's the other part that says, you like it, woman.
She then moves from that to get into the more evidential stuff.
We have the receipt of you getting petrol in the Ireland vehicle. We also have the receipt of you getting diesel at sale, Royal Sale, in your mainland vehicle, again the same day.
Now, it's not aggressive, but it's much more robust. You could see just this gentle change in his expression because he's a fairly impassive character. And I thought, yeah, you know now that danger is all around and actually that the door's closing here on you.
We've looked at the wages book as well. Do you accept that you did the Ireland run that week?
Yeah.
You do. So in effect that you would have been in Ireland from the morning of Wednesday the 12th of August until that evening.
Yeah.
He admitted he was in Northern Ireland, and that was a big moment for us.
We knew the police were doing their utmost to bring this to a conclusion. There was obviously things they could tell us, and there was things that we understood they couldn't tell us. We knew that it would come to maturity in the end, and we left it with them to do that.
If you saw a young girl, well, tell me what would happen then.
In the course of those interviews, it became clear for the first time he was now willing, or it appeared to be willing, to explore his culpability by way of a fantasy.
We'll look at her, try to guess what age she was, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I might park up for a couple of minutes and watch her.
And how long would you sit and watch the young girl, Robert?
No more than 5 minutes.
But effectively what he was doing was using the fantasy to admit his guilt to a particular extent.
In your fantasy, what the country situation would be like?
Well, it was just a narrow road. It was going downhill, and way at the bottom of the hill where the road curved away, there was a house set back from the road a bit. And it was the only house in sight.
And as he was doing it, these officers knew instinctively, having been at the location, that he was exactly describing the road in which Jennifer Cardy was abducted and the hedge in which Jennifer Cardy's bike was thrown behind. Spookily and chillingly, he was going as far as he was prepared to go in reliving those events.
And he almost admitted that he had killed Jennifer. He described exactly the spot where he had lifted her. He described it perfectly, so he did.
It's a tribute to those officers who interviewed him that they managed to get him there.
We felt in ourselves that we'd met the threshold, and then we began to construct the main file to go forward to the court process.
I was nearly sick in my stomach going to court. In truth, would you like to look at the person who murdered your daughter? That's a big thing for Pat and I. We often talked about it. Wish we never knew who had been caught. Wish we never had to look at the man who had been caught.
I was concerned about the impact on the family, although I knew they were very, very resilient, but even so, having travelled, but by that stage was a 30-year journey.
I had to sit watching this man, and he described why he liked little girls rather than mature women. And you know, all I could do was sit and weep at the thoughts of what our child had went through. It would have broke your heart.
And his expression never changed. He never changed, even though there was things said against him, accusations, information. His face never changed.
I remember waiting, and I can remember the jury coming back, and I can remember the judge warning that there should be no celebrations or any noise when the verdict was announced. And the foreman announced that he was guilty.
The verdict came back unanimous from the jury. It was just such a release. Since 1981, we've been waiting for so long for this.
We knew that this murder of Jennifer will not finish without an end result. We always had that faith to know that the Lord would eventually reveal who killed Jennifer.
We as a family really have never tried to understand or tried to think of what in the last hours of her life that she went through. And all of a sudden we're confronted with the awfulness of them last few hours and what she would have had to suffer. And that has been truly awful.
Whatever I said was from my heart, but in truth I can't remember.
Black stole the life of our daughter Jennifer, but Robert Black didn't steal the lives of me and my family.
Police say the investigation into Robert Black continues.
The story of Robert Black doesn't end with this verdict here today. There are lines of inquiry which we still have and that we are still looking at.
I had written to him when he was in prison, and I asked for a visit. I only sent the one letter, and I got no reply. I would have liked to have met him, talked to him, and understood what happened. I knew there was other families, other girls around the country that never had closure, and I would have really liked for them to have closure also.
Black was convicted. He was given a tariff of 25 years, which in effect meant he would eventually die in prison. He did die in prison, but a lot sooner than we would have wanted. He died in 2016. The news came through that he'd passed away natural causes in his cell.
I felt nothing when Robert Black died, except that perhaps he had died before he could have been held to account for other murders, including one very long-standing cold case in the West Country of Jeanette Tate, whose bicycle was found abandoned with the wheel still spinning in a road. And it's certain enough for Devon and Cornwall police to have been ready to charge him before he died.
Her body has never to this date been found. The inquiry was able to furnish Devon and Cornwall with a good deal of evidence. They themselves then developed that as best they could and were about to submit full case files and papers to the Crown Prosecution Service literally within weeks of the death in prison of Robert Black. It's taken a big chunk out of my life for many, many years. It was a continuation of what I personally had always set out to do, which was professionally to finish the case, to reach the finishing line.
These cases happened at a time of seismic change. I think 100 years from now, if they're writing the history of the turning points in criminal investigation, then I think that this case will merit a chapter in that history because of all the unique circumstances that came together.
This photograph here is of Jennifer, and one day she brought this photograph to me, framed, and she said, "You don't have a photograph of me in your office, so there's one, put that in your office." These photographs are on the dressing table right beside my bed, so they are. It reminds me what she looked like when she left home on her bike. I certainly miss Jennifer. You couldn't not miss Jennifer. Pat's passing has left a massive void. We were married for 54 years and we lived here together 45 years almost. The fact that Pat was alive when Robert Black was convicted was a fantastic relief. Pat started to write a memoir about Jennifer. It brings back so many emotions. I live a life of faith. Pat was now with Jennifer. Jennifer could never come back to us, but we can go to Jennifer.